Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Saturday. Thank you for joining us. You know, I always find it important and useful to provide some historical context to events that are taking place today, because I know it's not really provided in many other places, and it is important because you have media, you have the Democrats, some Republicans, podcasters, whatever. They want you to believe the world begins today, and they want to describe it. Well, the world didn't begin today. There's a lot of media attacks on the president, on the Secretary of War, on others involving this war, which has actually gone spectacularly well. Incredible, incredible. But I'm not going to fight that battle right now, a little later in the program. Right now, I want to give you some historical context. First of all, the attacks on Donald Trump by the press, which are vicious, which are constant. Same with the attacks on the Secretary of War, the attacks on the Vice President, the attacks on the Secretary of State, on the CIA Director. We have this guy, Joe Kent. He resigns. He issues a letter. Everybody uses the letter. The Democrats use the letter. The media use the letter. Now it turns out he's alleged to have leaked and he's under investigation, reportedly. Quite a mess, the media, but they'll pick up from anybody or anywhere to attack Donald Trump. So Donald Trump's reaction. The reaction of the administration. Here we have The Guardian, Margaret Sullivan, no fan of Trump, that's for sure. She writes, Trump now calls war reporting treason. His attacks on the press are escalating fast. And people are going, we've never seen anything like this. He must be a dictator. He's against the First Amendment. He's against freedom of the press. She writes, there's nothing completely new in Donald Trump's latest attacks on reporters, but they're more extreme now and even more indicative of what he wants: a docile press that provides propaganda, not factual journalism, for everything he does, including for his misguided war in Iran. Well, there you go, their partisanship and their activism. He even suggested this week that news organizations could be charged with treason for, or as he baselessly sees, spreading false information and thus helping America's enemies. He's getting plenty of help from top loyalists. The chair of the Federal Communications Commission, Brendan Carr, threatens the media and media companies that they could lose their licenses if they didn't get in line. Pete Hegseth, the former Fox News host, who's now the Secretary of Defense, War, is demanding more patriotic headlines and stories and expressed hope that CNN would soon be brought to heel by new Trump-friendly ownership. Hegseth's specific complaint was over CNN reporting that the administration had failed to fully foresee the war's effect on the Strait of Hormuz. Now, of course, the media are undermining the war effort because that's what they do. The media are attacking our military because that's what they do. The media are looking for every objector, every reprobate in the administration anonymously, some of them openly, who resign, and then they treat them like martyrs. You know, they put them up high. A weakened press and a would-be autocrat in the Oval Office? That's a deeply troubling combination for American democracy, and an especially dangerous one as Trump's ill-conceived and unpopular war rages on. I hear these historians say the same stuff. We've never seen anything like this. Oh, my Lord. This is a great threat to democracy. You hear the Democrats say it. We really don't believe in democracy anyway. All right, let's do a little history, and I think this is going to be very interesting. In a publication called Battlefields, Evidence of Unpopular Mr. Lincoln, considered one of our great presidents, although during almost his entire presidency, he was considered a failure. The illustrious, honest old Abe has continued during the last week to make a fool of himself and to mortify and shame the intelligent people of this great nation. His speeches have demonstrated the fact that although originally a Herculean rail splitter and more lately a whimsical storyteller and side splitter, he is no more capable of becoming a statesman, nay, even a moderate one, than the braying ass can become a noble lion. People now marvel how it came to pass that Mr. Lincoln should have been selected as the representative man of any party. His weak, wishy-washy, namby-pamby efforts, imbecile in manner, disgusting in manner, have made us the laughing stock of the whole world. The European powers will despise us because we have no better material out of which to make a president. The truth is, Lincoln is only a moderate lawyer, and in the larger cities of the Union could pass for no more than a fastidious pettifogger. Take him from his vocation and he loses even these small characteristics and indulges in simple twaddle, which would disgrace a well-bred schoolboy. Written as Abraham Lincoln approached Washington by train for his 1861 presidential inauguration. He hadn't even been in office yet. This tirade was not the rant of a fire-eating cessationist editor in Richmond or New Orleans. It was the declaration of the Salem Advocate, a newspaper printed in Lincoln's home ground of central Illinois. And the Advocate had plenty of company among Northern opinion makers. The editor of Massachusetts, influential Springfield Republican, Samuel Bowles, despaired in a letter to a friend that same week, "Lincoln is a simple Susan." The most esteemed orator in America, Edward Everett, wrote in his diary, "He is evidently a person of very inferior cast of character, wholly unequal to the crisis." From Washington, Congressman Charles Francis Adams wrote, "His speeches have fallen like a wet blanket here. They put to flight all notion of greatness." Then at the end of his journey, in a few days, Lincoln was forced to sneak into the Capitol on a secret midnight train to avoid assassination, disguised in a soft felt hat, a muffler, and a short bobtailed coat. After Lincoln's unseemly arrival, the contempt in the nation's reaction was so widespread, so vicious, and so personal that it marks this episode as the historic low point of presidential prestige in the United States. Even the Northern press winced at the president's undignified start. Vanity Fair observed, by the advice of weak men who should straddle through life in petticoats instead of disgracing such many garments as pantaloons and coats, the president-elect disguises himself after the manner of heroes in 2-shilling novels and rides secretly in the deep night from Harrisburg to Washington. The Brooklyn Eagle, in a column titled "Mr. Lincoln's Flight by Moonlight Alone," suggested the president deserved the deepest disgrace that the crushing indignation of a whole people can inflict. The New York Tribune joked darkly, "Mr. Lincoln may live 100 years without having so good a chance to die." Known almost exclusively by his got-up nickname, the Rail Splitter, Lincoln had won the 1860 election in November with 39.8% of the popular vote. This absurdly low total was partly due to the fact that 4 candidates were on the ballot, but it remains the poorest showing by any winning president candidate in American history. In fact, Lincoln received a smaller percentage of the popular vote than nearly all the losers of 2-party presidential elections. Immediately, however, in this scant total dropped in the panic of the secession winter, as 7 southern states left the Union and worried Northerners repented their votes for their Illinoism. At the time he was sworn in, Lincoln's approval rating could be estimated by examining wintertime Republican losses. They were losing in one state after another, Republican states and so forth and so on. It was a disaster. A disaster. Even in Republican strongholds, the Republican Party started to turn against Abraham Lincoln all across the country, and he'd barely been president. It was the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, which we all hail, right? He declared that all blacks were free men in the South. And the South said, excuse us? And the Northerners said, you don't have the constitutional authority to do it. And by the way, there was a serious question about it. It was considered a very, very brave act. So it was the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, according to the modern view, that signals the disappearance of the novice rail splitter and marks the emergence of the ultimate statesman, the great emancipator. That's what he was called after he signed that. But it wasn't so at the time. The Chicago Times, for example, branded the Emancipation Proclamation a monstrous usurpation, a criminal wrong, an act of national suicide. An editorial in Columbia, Ohio's The Crisis asked, these are Republican states, is not this a death blow to the hope of union? We have no doubt that this proclamation seals the fate of this union as it was and the Constitution as it is. The time is brief when we shall have a dictator proclaimed, for the proclamation can never be carried out except under the iron rule of the worst kind of despotism. Lincoln had a hell of a time for the entire time he was president of the United States. Less than 2 months later, the midterm election of 1862, I'm jumping ahead, the Northerners handed down their judgment on the emancipator. It was a condemnation, a thumping Republican defeat by Republicans. What the New York Times called a vote of want of confidence in Abraham Lincoln. The middle states that had swept the rail splitter into the presidency in 1860, Illinois, his home state, Indiana, New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, had now deserted him. All of them sent new Democrat majorities to Congress. To them was added New Jersey, which was Republican Donnybrook. In all, the number of Democrats in the House almost doubled from 44 to 75, cutting the Republican majority from 70% to 55%. Heartsick at the Republicans' run, Alexander McClure of Pennsylvania wrote, "I could not conceive it possible for Lincoln to successfully administer the government and prosecute the war, with the 6 most important loyal states declaring against him at the polls." When the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1, 1863, Lincoln was pilloried again in the Northern press, and desertions by disgusted soldiers climbed into the thousands. Seeing no slaves freed, even abolitionists were soured by the proclamation's impotence. As the cold, hard rains of winter announced the approach of the 3rd year of the war's unimaginable sorrow, Lincoln was isolated and alone. Suddenly, warnings were everywhere that just as Lincoln's election that sparked the secession of the South out of fear that he would abolish slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation would spark the secession of the Old Northwest, the states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. Now that the fear had been made real, Army recruitment came to a halt in those states. In response, Congress rushed through the draft law, the federal conscription, first time in the history of the nation. To many, the appearance of United States enrollers going from house to house was visible proof that the tentacles of Lincoln's government were cutting around every American. I briefly stop. Just think about how they talk about ICE today. The same Democrats trashing Lincoln. Just think about how they talk about Trump and ICE today. Think about it. 100 years from now, it'll be recorded and it'll be read the way I'm reading to you now about Lincoln. Lincoln secured his renomination at the party convention in early June 1864, but there was no enthusiasm for him. He won by using the spoils systems practice of stacking the party convention with appointees, delegates who owed their jobs to him. Things got worse over the election summer. There was the embarrassment of the near capture of Washington in July 1864 by a rebel detachment under Lieutenant General Jubal Early. The price of gold soared as speculators betted against a Union victory. Seeing Lincoln wounded, the radical Republicans went in for the kill. On August 5, the New York Tribune devoted 2 columns to a sensational radical declaration known as the Wade Davis Manifesto that charged their own nominee with grave executive usurpation. And he studied outrage on the legislative authority. It was the fiercest, most public challenge to Lincoln, or for that matter, any president, authority over issued by members of his own party. With the appearance of this surely fatal blow, everyone considered Lincoln a beaten man, including the president himself. The Democratic New World savored the spectacle of Lincoln's demise, reprinting an editorial from the Richmond Examiner. The fact begins to shine out clear. It announced that Abraham Lincoln is lost, that he will never be president again. The obscene ape of Illinois is about to be disposed in late August. However, the Democrats nominated George McClellan on a platform that declared the war is a failure, peace now. Sounds like the Democrats today. Suddenly, as bad as Lincoln may have seemed for many Republicans, he could never be as bad as McClellan. The general who battled the Republicans more fiercely than he ever had the rebels now peddled peace at any price. And then on September 3, only 3 days after the Chicago Convention adjourned, a second, even more amazing deliverance arrived at the White House in the form of a telegram. This is what saved Lincoln's election. From Major General William Sherman in Georgia, Atlanta is ours and fairly won. The Battle of Atlanta. Its 6 simple words translated a military victory in Georgia into a political miracle unequaled in American history. The most extraordinary change in public opinion that has ever been known. Now, I could go on. I hope I have piqued your interest. But Mark, what does this have to do with anything? You see how the press treated Lincoln? Well, Lincoln just didn't sit still for it. You see how this Margaret Sullivan writes about Trump? Oh, he's calling us treasonous. Oh, we've never seen anything like this. Democracy is being threatened. We've never seen anything like this. Oh, yes, we have. And much, much worse. As pointed out here in Live Journal, Lincoln used censorship of journalists and newspapers whose views did not accord with the administration or its prosecution of the war, justifying a practice of shutting down newspapers, censoring newspapers, as being one which saved lives and shortened the war. Many newspapers that were critical of the Union and the Union cause were censored or shut down. The reporters were treated differently depending on how they reported from the battlefield. Some editors were even jailed for their anti-administration views. Often it was members of the public through mob action who took it upon themselves to violently censor the newspapers. Freedom of the press was a casualty of the Civil War, and the real debate is whether or not this was justified under the circumstances of the war. Newspapers were shut down, newspapers were threatened, editors were arrested, reporters were arrested. You saw prosecutions take place. Lincoln was able to effect control of the press censorship, and in major part also because of the telegram passing information. Well, the Army took it over, then the Treasury Department took it over, then the Army took it over again. In all, journalistic dispatches, U.S. mail, and telegraphs were all routinely censored as part of the administration's war efforts. People were arrested for wearing Confederate buttons and for singing Confederate songs. Government officials shut down the Chicago Times. They shut down other newspapers, the Sunday Chronicle in Washington, D.C. Lincoln even had a member of Congress, Clement Vallandigham, a prominent Democrat member of Congress from Ohio, arrested for making anti-war speech in his home state. After his conviction by a military tribunal, he was sentenced to prison. Lincoln, however, changed the punishment to banishment. He was removed from that part of the country to another part of the country. Now, I'm not encouraging any of this, of course. That's not the point. The point is the press was utterly disgusting and irresponsible during the Civil War when we had a great president who was trying to keep the country together, horrific casualties, and he was trying to eliminate slavery. We have a great president today who's taken on a horrendous enemy that has killed thousands of Americans directly and indirectly, that was building nuclear weapons to blow us off the face of the earth, that has slaughtered tens of thousands of its own people, that was building ballistic missiles to reach the United States. Finally, a president steps up like a Lincoln, in this case a Trump, and he's dealing with it in a spectacular fashion, and the press, just as horrendous as the Civil War press. But history will judge the press very, very negatively during this period and throughout the Trump years. And I'm convinced they will judge the president as one of the greats. What he's doing now with Iran took courage and foresight, and he's taking responsibility for it like Lincoln did the Civil War, and history will reward him.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.